Hello, hello.
Hello,
Oh,
hello.
nice to
How are
meet
you
you.
guys?
Hi, Jeanette.
How
How's it
are
going?
how are ya?
Oh gosh, good. I'm good. This is a very interesting choice. I love this. I love
Yeah,
it.
yeah. I can't wait to talk about the inspiration for it. Really,
Okay, okay. That's
very
all
much.
coming.
What's that?
That's all coming with your facilitation.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh man, this. I mean, I never really anticipated this would be like the thing I'd be facilitating.
Yeah,
Uh,
no kidding.
but yeah, I kind of was inspired. Really, I'll tell you more about it when I get into it.
Sure,
But
totally. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I get it. I don't want to spoil it. So Andrea had to pull out, eh? Did you find someone else
Yeah.
to replace her or just?
She messaged me as well. It's all good. We've got four. There's four of us today reading.
Good. It's good. It's fine. Okay, that's
So
fine. She's
yeah,
been so good. She's been involved in the last like three of them or something. So
yeah, and in a major role, right? In
yeah,
all of
yeah,
those, right? So that's really great.
it's good. It's
So
good.
yeah, all good. Take a break.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. She's been trying to get that a couple of rooms rented in her house, so she's had a lot of stress.
Oh yeah, that's right. Because her and Michaela are roommates, right?
They were. It's
Well, they
Michaela
were.
was one
They
of the
were.
ones who left, and it was she was one of the ones because Michaela's moved in with Sebastian in Prince Edward County.
Yeah. How was that move?
Oh, great, but she just had her tonsils out. So
Oh.
she's in a lot of agony. Mick has had tonsil problems her whole life. And it was high time to get them out because it was interfering with her instrument playing, with singing, with everything.
Yeah, for
So,
sure.
but to get them out as an adult is a super painful thing. So,
Yeah, that's no fun.
but she's going to tune in today and listen.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Is she hey Mia, how's it going?
Yeah.
Pretty good.
Awesome. Awesome.
Great.
Hey, Mia. Nice to see you in Toronto.
Are you in Toronto now? No.
I'm not. I'm still in New Brunswick for another couple of
Oh,
months.
sorry. I only mean that Amelia and I knew each other in a past life.
Oh, okay. I see.
Yeah.
Okay. I got you. Yes, I always know that she's the fellow Atlantic buddy.
How is it in the bubble?
Great.
It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really great.
Man, we wanted so badly to come over there.
Yeah.
Well,
We really
I
did.
just booked my flight. I'm coming to Toronto in October. So I know that but I am, or at least I'm coming to Prince Edward County. And
Of course.
it's my dad's 90th birthday.
Wow.
And I wasn't there when my mom died in April. And so I just feel like I can't not be there for this. So I'm gonna mask it up and
Yeah.
quarantine when I get back, because I don't have to quarantine there, but I have to quarantine when I get back.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Oy, oy. Well, yeah, nice that you can spend some time. That you can spend some time here with
It's
him.
good. It's good.
For
It's
sure.
also weird.
That it is. Yeah.
It was kind of fabulous buying a plane ticket, though. That's, like to be reminded of that. Yeah, right.
Right. Like, oh, this is a thing I can do. Like, I used to do this sometimes, every now and again. Get on a plane and go somewhere.
I thought it was going to be really expensive, just given that there are so few flights and they must be like really hurting. But it wasn't. It was the same price as before. So I'm going, okay, that's good.
Wow.
No
Wow.
complaints.
Yeah. Like, yeah, I would have expected like big sort of,
Mm-hmm.
but I guess then at the same time, it's like with less seats to fill, you've kind of got to like, I guess there's a balance to be struck there. Raising prices, you can offset costs and all that kind of stuff.
Yep. That's right. That's right. Oh, my glasses are mungy. Eesh. I have a thing somewhere. Oh yeah, I do.
Awesome. Well, I think we'll give it just like a couple more minutes. We've got everybody who's reading today because Andrea can't make it, so it's just the four of us. But we'll just hold off a few as I like reprimand my dog.
Oh,
Baggett, come on, good boy.
doggy.
No barking, buddy. No barking.
We go.
Oh goodness. I'm sure they're gonna make an appearance during.
That's good. We like that. They're good.
I was gonna mention I've got my puppy here as well, and like he's he's feeling very affectionate today. He doesn't want to be separated.
That's
Bring
cute.
him on.
What kind of a dog do you have?
He's a German Shepherd.
Oh, love it.
He's
Love
just
it.
downstairs causing trouble with something right now, and I'm not sure what.
You say puppy, but I also say puppy, but mine isn't a puppy. What is like? How old's your dog?
I think he's like 7 or 8 months now.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
So
yeah.
Yeah.
legit
for
puppy.
sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like I'm just gonna call him a puppy forever.
Yeah. Well, like it just comes out every time I mention any of the dogs. Puppy.
Right? Yeah, yeah. Ah, cute puppy. You're like, yeah,
Yeah.
he's like 7. Like, yeah, it's still a puppy.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. How is like training and stuff going?
Training.
Like the puppy, the 7 or
Oh, that's not my responsibility. So.
Oh. Fair enough.
Oh, that's the best.
Awesome.
He is. Got Mr. Hank.
Ah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yankee.
Oh, look at him. Oh,
That's
what a beautiful
brilliant.
dog.
Yeah.
I
He's
found
so
out
cute.
recently that Beckett has some Belgian Shepherd
Ooh.
in his like mix. Yeah, because he's a pot cake like from the Caribbean street dog. I have no idea what I had no idea what his breed was, and really no interest in doing paying for a DNA test or anything. So I was like, he's an awesome dog. I love him. What's it gonna change if I know like what his breed is? But I'm in this pot cake group with a bunch of other folks who own dogs from the same place, and one of them owns his brother. So they did a DNA test on their dog, and so by extension, they're part of the same litter. She just shared the results and was like, "Here's what your dog's breed is." I was like, "Well, that's cool. Now I know." So yeah, some Belgian Shepherd, but mostly Whippet.
Whip it.
Whip it good.
Whip it real good.
Alrighty, well I guess it's 2 p.m. so we can get going. It's a small group today. Yeah, like we said, Andrea couldn't make it, unfortunately, but all good. We've got a different vibe today than we usually do. So yeah, I mean, I think we can still do the same sort of thing as before, where when you're not telling your story, everybody can like turn their mics and cameras off, and when you're telling your story, just make sure to turn those back on. Besides that, I don't think there's really anything more to the etiquette of this. I'm just kind of renaming myself so that there we go. Oh, I guess I should put you on too. Okay, this is true. Okay, here we go.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. Awful. There you go.
Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so I am facilitating this, and I just thought it would be kind of important to share like where this idea came from. So Crystal and I had recently done a bit of traveling. Initially, we had wanted to come out and visit the East Coast. We didn't get to. Crystal is from the East Coast, and I've never been, so we wanted to go there. Obviously, COVID being what it is, we couldn't make it out, so we decided to do a bit of an Southern Ontario tour. So we did Kilbear. We were in Kilbear Park. We were in Algonquin. We did Bob Cajun. But I think for both of us, the most inspiring, beautiful, like our favorite part of the trip was really when we went to Manitoulin Island. It was like both like the landscape was really beautiful. Unlike some of the places like Bob Cajun or Tobermory where we were at, which were quite like tourist heavy. Manitoulin feels very secluded, very sort of isolated. I guess as an island, it kind of has that that going for it in that respect. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the conversations that we had with some of the local people there, they're very firm on sort of keeping like big chains out, keeping sort of like tourism at large sort of out as much as possible, and keeping this sort of like isolated, very like natural state of the island intact, and you really feel it when you're there. It's quite beautiful. But we had a really interesting conversation with the artistic director of the Debojamajig Theater there, which is a big Indigenous theater company. And it was really quite a revealing conversation. I feel like we learned quite a bit in talking with her. And they had suggested that we go and visit some of the historical sites. So we got to see an old residential, a Jesuit school that had been built there, which was burned down. There was like a boys' school and a girls' school, both of which were burned down in like quick succession. And yeah, going to that place was quite profound. It was a very like moving sort of awe-inspiring, eerie kind of moment to be standing in that space. And this is a space where Debauch does a lot of their programming. They actually like do outdoor theater. Like there's no roof on the place. It's just like open. It's just an open stone structure. The rest of it was all burnt down, and now it stands there, and they do theater in this space. And one of the places that we were recommended to go was this lovely little shop called Julia's. Lillian's, whoops. Lillian's, yeah. So Lillian's, yeah, thank you so much. I'm glad you're here.
I was there.
Yeah, you were there. Yeah, Lillian's had some really fantastic products, all by local artists, local indigenous artists and craftspeople. And one of the things that really caught both Crystal and my attention were these books that they had. These like folk tales, these Ojibwe folk tales that were then illustrated and written down. And they were, yeah, there was two of them. One was this one, How the Bees Got Their Stingers. And the one that you bought was, do you remember?
It was Kakaka the owl.
Oh yeah, that's right. A story about an owl. And anyway, we sort of read them after we had left Manitoulin. We read them one night. We had like no internet access, and what do you do when you have no internet access? You like read each other's stories. So we like read these folk stories to each other, and it was a really revealing moment for me, just in the sense that like and I'm sure many people feel very isolated in their own like traditions. Like, you know, I come from a German culture, and like I'm sort of surrounded by Canadian culture, and so I'm familiar with the folk stories of like my tradition, and I'm familiar with the art and practices of like Western and North American traditions, but I feel often very disconnected from other cultures, and especially like the folk narratives and fairy tales that come from different cultural traditions. And I thought it would be a really cool experiment just to see like who might have some folk stories, fairy tales, what have you, from their traditions, and just to tell them. For me, the one that I'm going to be telling today is something that was made a big impression on me as a child. So yeah, that's what I'll be sharing, and I'll get to that later. But just since I spent a lot of time talking about these Ojibwe folk tales, that we found, I also want to segue into a land acknowledgement for today. So the land that I am calling in from today, that we're calling in from today, is the traditional land of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. As we're reading these stories, I guess the three questions that I sort of want to open with, and just sort of open up the dialogue later on with, is, you know, how is the folk or fairy tale that you're telling today different from some of the other ones that you're hearing? How is it similar maybe to some of the stories that you hear? And do you feel that there's value in retelling these stories now, in the time that we're living in? So those sort of three questions to sort of like we'll talk about later, but I just thought it would be interesting to think about those as we're listening to the tales. So mine happens to be a picture book. And I have managed to find an electronic version. So I am going to be actually sharing my screen today. So yeah, here we go. Let's dive in. So I'm just gonna get set up here. Awesome. So I'm going to be reading actually two because they're very short. Two very short stories today from a collection by Heinrich Hoffmann, and the collection is called Stoffelpeter. So this is the first story that I'm going to be telling, which is called Die Geschichte vom Daumenlutscher, which, roughly translated means the story of the thumb sucker, basically. So it goes something like this. One day, Mama said, Conrad, dear, I must go out and leave you here. But mind now, Conrad, what I say, don't suck your thumb while I'm away. The great tall tailor always comes to little boys who suck their thumbs, and ere they dream what he's about, he takes his great sharp scissors out and cuts their thumbs clean off, and then, they never grow back again. Mama had scarcely turned her back. The thumb was in, alack, alack. The door flew open. In he ran, the great long red-legged scissor man. Oh, children, see, the tailor's come and caught out little suck-a-thumb. Snip, snap, snip, the scissors go, and Conrad cries out, oh, oh, oh. Snip, snap, snip, they go so fast that both his thumbs are off at last. Mama comes home, there Conrad stands, and looks quite sad and shows his hands. Ah, said Mama, I knew he'd come, to naughty little suck-a-thumb. So that's the first story. It's a German folktale. The Brothers Grimm were not alone in their sort of, gruesome fairy tales. Heinrich Hoffmann was also quite the same and writing around the same era as well. So I'm going to be reading one more story. This one is called the story of Johnny Head in the Air. Now it's kind of interesting that it's called Johnny Head in the Air because in the German version his name is Hans, and the German translation is Die Geschichte, the story, vom Hans Guck in die Luft, which means head in the clouds, basically. So here is the story. As he trudged along to school, it was always Johnny's rule to be looking at the sky and the clouds that floated by. But what just before him lay in his way, Johnny never thought about, so that everyone cried out, look at little Johnny there, little Johnny head in the air. There we go. Running just in Johnny's way came a little dog one day. Johnny's eyes were still astray, up on high in the sky, and he never heard them cry, Johnny, mind the dog is nigh. Bump, dump, down they fell with such a thump, dog and Johnny in a lump. Once, with head as high as ever, Johnny walked beside the river. Johnny watched the swallows trying, which was cleverest at flying. Oh, what fun! Johnny watched the bright round sun, going in and coming out. This was all he thought about. So he strode on, only think, to the river's very brink, where the bank was high and steep, and the water very deep. And the fishes in a row stared to see him coming so. One step more, oh, sad to tell, headlong in poor Johnny fell, and the fishes in dismay wagged their tails and swam away. There lay Johnny on his face, with his nice red writing case. But as they were passing by, two strong men had heard him cry, and with sticks these two strong men hooked poor Johnny out again. Oh, you should have seen him shiver when they pulled him from the river. He was in sorry plight, dripping wet, and such a fright. Wet all over, everywhere, clothes and arms and face and hair. Johnny never will forget what it is to be so wet. And the fishes, 1, 2, 3, are come back again, you see. Up they came the moment after to enjoy the fun and laughter. Each popped out his little head, and to tease poor Johnny said, silly Johnny, look, you've lost your writing book. Therein lies the tale of Hans Kuchendiluft. So, that's all for my stories by Heinrich Hoffmann. Up next, we've got... thank you. Up next, we've got Mia, who's got some stories to share with us.
So I wasn't sure like what length we were going for because I have a really long one or I have a short one.
Totally up to you. We're okay. I mean, we've only got four readers today. So if you want to do the longer one, go ahead.
I would really like to because it's a favorite of mine from when I was a kid. It's called The White Cat by Madame D'Aulnoy. It's a French tale. I'm a mud of Europe, so I've got all those cultures in there.
Awesome.
All right, so it's once upon a time, there was a king who had 3 brave and handsome sons. He was afraid they might become anxious to reign during his lifetime. The king felt he was growing old, but his mental capacity being undiminished, he had no fancy for vacating in their favor a place he filled so worthily. He thought, therefore, that the best way to live in peace was by amusing them with promises which he could always elude the performance of. He called them into his closet, and after having spoken very kindly to them, he added, "You will agree with me, my dear children, that my great age forbids my applying myself to the business of the state with so much assiduity as formerly. I fear my subjects may suffer from this circumstance. I wish to transfer my crown to one of you, but to deserve such a gift, it is but just that you should on your parts seek to please me. Now, as I contemplate retiring into the country, it appears to me that a pretty, faithful, and intelligent little dog would be an excellent companion for me. So, in lieu of preferring my eldest to my youngest son, I declare to you that whichever of you 3 shall bring me the handsomest little dog shall forthwith become my heir." The princes were exceedingly surprised at the inclination the king expressed for a little dog. But the 2 youngest saw they might find their account in it and accepted with pleasure the commission to go in search of one. The eldest was too timid or too respectful to urge his own right. They took leave of the king, who distributed amongst them money and jewels, adding that the following year, without fail, on the same day and hour, they would return and bring him their little dogs. Before setting out, they repaired to a castle within a league of the city, assembled therein their most intimate friends, and gave splendid banquets, at which the 3 brothers pledged to each other an eternal friendship, and declared that they would act in the affair in question without jealousy or mortification, and that the successful candidate would be always ready to share his fortune with the others. At length they departed, agreeing to meet on their return at the same castle, thence to proceed together to the king. They declined having any followers and changed their names that they might not be known. Each took a different road. The 2 eldest met with many adventures, but I shall only recount those of the youngest. He was well-mannered, of a gay and joyous temperament, had an admirable head, a noble figure, regular features, fine teeth, and was very skillful in all exercise that became a prince, sang agreeably, touched the lute and thuribo with a delicacy that charmed every one, could paint, in one word, was highly accomplished, and as to his courage, it amounted to intrepidity. Scarcely a day passed that he did not buy dogs, big or little, greyhounds, mastiffs, bloodhounds, pointers, spaniels, water dogs, lap dogs. The instant he found one handsomer than the other, he let the first go to keep the new purchase. For it would have been impossible for him to lead about with himself 30 or 40,000 dogs, and he persevered in his determination to have neither gentlemen nor valets nor pages in his train. He continued his journey without having any fixed point to proceed to, when night, accompanied with thunder and rain, surprised him in a forest through which he was no longer able to trace a path. He took the first he could find, and having walked a long way, he saw a glimmer of light, which convinced him that there was some habitation near him in which he might find shelter till the morning. Guided by the light, he came to the gate of the most magnificent castle that could ever be imagined. The gate was of gold, covered with carbuncles, the pure and vivid light of which illuminated all the neighborhood. It was this light which the prince had perceived at a great distance. The walls were of transparent porcelain of several colors, on which were represented the histories of all the fairies from the beginning of the world to that day. The rain and storm prevented him staying longer on the spot where he was being wetted to the skin. Besides, which he could not see anything beyond where the light of the carbuncles extended to. He returned to the Golden Gate. He saw a kid's foot attached to a chain of diamonds. He admired all this magnificence and the security in which the owners of the castle appeared to live in. For, after all, said he, what is to prevent thieves from coming and cutting down this chain and pulling the carbuncles off the gate? They would enrich themselves forever. He pulled the kid's foot and immediately heard a bell ring, which seemed by its sound to be of gold or of silver. A moment after, the gate was opened without his perceiving anything except a dozen of hands in the air, each of which held a flambeau. He was so astonished that he hesitated to advance, when he felt other hands which pushed him forwards with gentle violence. He moved on, therefore, with some distrust, and at all risks, keeping his hand on the hilt of his sword. But on entering the vestibule, entirely encrusted with the periphery and lapis lazuli, he heard two enchanting voices which sang these words: "Start not at the hands you see, nor fear in this delightful place aught except a lovely face, if from love your heart would flee." He could not believe that he was invited so graciously for the purpose of eventually injuring him, so that feeling himself pushed towards a large gate of coral which opened directly that he approached it, he entered a saloon of a mother of pearl, and afterwards passed through several apartments variously ornamented and so rich with paintings and jewels that he was perfectly enchanted with them. Thousands and thousands of lights from the vaulted roof of the saloon down to the floor illuminated a portion of the other apartments, which were also filled with chandeliers and stages covered with wax candles. In fact, the magnificence was so great that he was not easy to imagine the possibility of it. After having passed through 60 rooms, the hands stopped him. He saw a large easy chair moving by itself towards the fireplace. At the same moment, the fire was lighted, and the hands, which appeared to him very handsome, white, small, plump, and well-shaped, began to undress him, for he was wet through, as I have already told you, and they were afraid he would catch cold. They presented him, still without him seeing any one, with a shirt as fine as if it was on a wedding day, and a morning gown of some rich stuff shot with gold and embroidered with little emeralds and ciphers. The bodiless hands moved a table close to him, on which his toilette is set out. Nothing could be more magnificent. They combed him with a lightness and a skill which was very agreeable to him. Finally, they dressed him again, but not in his own clothes. They brought him others, much richer. He observed with silent wonder all that took place, and occasionally felt some slight alarm, which he could not altogether conquer. After they had powdered, curled, perfumed, adorned, attired, and made him look handsomer than Adonis, the hands led him into a hall superbly lit and furnished. Around it were represented the stories of all the most famous cats. Nothing was ever more curious than these paintings. The cloth was laid, and there were 2 covers, each accompanied by its own golden cadenas. The buffet astonished him by the quantity of cups upon it of rock crystal and 1,000 rare stones. The prince could not imagine for whom the 2 covers were placed, when he saw several cats take their places in a small orchestra, fitted up expressly for them. One held a music book, the notes in which were of the most extraordinary kind, another a roll of paper to beat time with, and the rest had little guitars. Suddenly, each began to mew in a different tone and to scratch the strings of their guitars with their claws. It was the strangest music that he had ever heard. The prince would have thought himself in the infernal regions if he had not found the palace too marvelously beautiful to permit him to fall into such an error. But he stopped his ears and laughed heartily at the sight of the various postures and grimaces of these novel musicians. He was meditating on the different things that had already happened to him in the chateau when he saw a little figure enter the hall, scarcely a cubit in height. This poppet was covered with a long black crepe veil. 2 cats preceded it, dressed in deep mourning and wearing cloaks and swords. A numerous train of cats followed, some carrying rat traps full of rats and others mice in cages. The prince could not recover from his astonishment. He knew not what to think. The little black figure approached, and lifting its veil, he perceived the most beautiful little white cat that ever was and ever will be. She had a very youthful and very melancholy air, and commenced a mewing so soft and sweet that it went straight to the heart. Son of a king, she said to the prince, thou art welcome. My mewing majesty beholds thee with pleasure. Madam Cat, said the prince, it is very generous of you to receive me with so much attention, but you do not appear to me to be an ordinary little animal. The gift you have of speech and the superb castle you inhabit are sufficient evidence to the contrary. Son of a king, rejoined the white cat, I pray thee cease to pay me compliments. I am plain in my language and my manners, but I have a kind heart. Come, continued she, let them serve supper and bid the concert cease, for the prince does not understand what they are singing. And are they singing any words, madam? Inquired he. Undoubtedly, she answered. We have poets here of considerable talent, and if you remain amongst us some time, you will be convinced of the fact. It is only for you to say so and to be believed, replied the prince politely, but I must also consider you, madam, a cat of very rare description. The supper was served up. It was placed on the table by the hands of invisible bodies. First, there were two soups, one of pigeons and the other of very fat mice. The sight of the latter prevented the prince from touching the former, believing that the same cook had concocted both. But the little cat, who guessed from the face he made what was passing his mind, assured him that their meals had been cooked separately, and that he might eat what was set before him with the perfect assurance that there were neither rats nor mice in it. The prince did not wait to be told twice, feeling satisfied that the pretty little cat had no wish to deceive him. After supper, the white cat invited her guests to enter a saloon, in which there was a theater wherein 12 cats and 12 monkeys danced a ballet. One party was dressed as Moors, the other as Chinese. It is easy to imagine the leaps and capers they executed, and every now and then they gave each other a scratch or two. Thus finished the evening. The white cat said good night to her guest. The hands who had been his conductors so far took hold of him again and led him into an apartment quite different from any he had seen. It was not so magnificent as it was elegant. The hangings were all of butterflies' wings, and various colors of which formed 1,000 different flowers. There were also feathers of exceedingly rare birds, and which perhaps have never been seen elsewhere. The bed furniture was of gauze, tied up with 1,000 bows of riband. There were large mirrors from the ceiling to the floor, with frames of chased gold representing 1,000 little cupids. The prince went to bed without saying a word, for there was no means of talking with the hands that waited upon him. He slept little and was awakened by a confused noise. The hands immediately lifted him out of bed and dressed him in a hunting habit. He looked into the courtyard of the castle and perceived more than 500 cats, some of whom led greyhounds in the slips, others were blowing the horn. It was a grand fete day. White Cat was going to hunt and wished the prince to accompany her. The officious hands presented him with a wooden horse, which went full gallop and kept up the pace wonderfully. He made some objection to mounting it, saying that it wanted but little to make him a knight-errant like Don Quixote, but his resistance was useless. They placed him on the wooden horse. The housings and the saddle were embroidered with gold and diamonds. White Cat rode a monkey, the handsomest and proudest that he had ever seen. She had thrown off her long veil and wore a dragoon's cap, which made her look so bold that she frightened all the mice in the neighborhood. Never was there a more agreeable hunting party. The cats outran the rabbits and hares, and as fast as they caught them, the white cat had the curé made in her presence, and 1,000 skillful feats were performed to the great gratification of the whole company. The birds, on their part, were no means safe, for the kittens climbed the trees, and the great monkey carried the white cat up to the nests of the eagles, to place at her mercy their little highnesses, the eaglets. The hunt being over, the white cat took a horn, about the length of one's finger, but which gave out a tone so clear and loud that it was easily heard 10 leagues off. As soon as she had sounded it 2 or 3 flourishes, she was surrounded by all the cats in the country. Some appeared in the air, riding in chariots, others came in boats by water. In short, there were so many never seen together before. They were all dressed in different fashions and attended by this splendid train. She returned to the castle, requesting the prince accompany her. He was perfectly willing to do so, notwithstanding that so much caterwauling smacked a little of witches' festivals, and that the talking cat astonished him beyond all the rest. As soon as she reached home, she put on her great black veil. She supped with the prince, who was hungry, and did justice to the good cheer. They brought him some liqueurs, which he sipped with much satisfaction, and they immediately effaced all recollection of the little dog he was meant to find for the king. He no longer thought of anything but mewing with White Cat, that is to say, remaining her kind and faithful companion. He passed his days in agreeable amusements, sometimes fishing, sometimes hunting, after which there were ballets, carousels, and 1,000 other things which entertained him exceedingly. Even the beautiful cat herself frequently composed verses and sonnets so full of passionate tenderness that it seemed as if she had a susceptible heart, and that no one could speak as she did without being in love. But her secretary, who was an old cat, wrote such a vile scrawl that although her works have been preserved, it is impossible to read them. The prince had forgotten even the land of his birth. The hands of which I have spoken continued to wait upon him. He regretted sometimes that he was not a cat, to pass his whole life in such excellent company. Alas, said he to the White Cat, how wretched it will make me to leave you. I love you so dearly. Either become a woman or make me a cat. She was amused by his wish and returned him some mysterious answers, out of which he could scarcely make anything. A year flies away quickly when one has neither care nor pain, when one is merry and in good health. White Cat knew the time at which the prince was bound to return, and as he thought no more of it, she reminded him, "Dost know," said she, "that thou hast only 3 days left to look for the little dog that the king thy father wishes for, and that thy brothers have already found several very beautiful?" The prince's memory returned to him, and astonished at his negligence, "What secret spell," he exclaimed, "could have made me to forget such a thing, the most important to me in the world? My honor and my fortune are staked upon it. Where shall I find such a dog as will win a kingdom for me, and a horse swift enough to perform such a journey in so short a time?" He began to be very anxious and sorrowful. White Cat said to him with much sweetness, "Son of a king, do not distress thyself. I am thy friend. Thou mayst yet remain here 1 day longer, and although it is 500 leagues from this to your country, the great wooden horse will carry you there in less than 12 hours. "I thank you, beautiful cat," said the prince, "but it is not sufficient for me merely to return to my father. I must take him a little dog." "Hold," said White Cat. "Here is an acorn which contains one more beautiful than the dog star." "Oh, Madam Cat," cried the prince, "your majesty jests with me." "Put the acorn to your ear," rejoined she, "and you will hear it bark." He obeyed her, and immediately the little dog went bow wow, which transported the prince with delight, for such a dog as could be contained in an acorn was certainly to be very diminutive indeed. He was going to open the acorn, so eager was he to see the dog, but White Cat told him that it might catch a cold on the journey, so it would be better for him to wait till he was in the presence of his royal father. He thanked her 1,000 times and took a most tender leave of her. "I assure you," he added, "that the days I have passed with you have flown so quickly that I regret in some measure leaving you behind me. And although you are a sovereign here, and all the cats that compose your court possess much more wit and gallantry than ours, I do not hesitate to invite you to come with me." The cat replied to this invitation only by a deep sigh. They parted. The prince was the first to reach the castle, which he had appointed to meet his brothers. They arrived shortly after him, and were surprised to see a wooden horse in the courtyard. The prince came forward to receive them. They embraced several times and recounted their travels to each other. But our prince kept his principal adventures a secret from the others, and showed them an ugly turnspit, observing that he thought it was so beautiful that he had selected it for presentation with the king. Notwithstanding the friendship that existed between the brothers, the two eldest felt a secret joy at the bad taste of their younger brother. Being seated at a table, they trod on each other's toes by way of signifying that they had not much fear on that account. The next morning, they set out together in the same coach. The king's 2 eldest sons carried in baskets some little dogs, so beautiful and delicate that one could scarcely venture to touch them. The youngest son carried the poor turnspit, which was so filthy that nobody could bear the sight of it. As soon as they set foot in the palace, everybody surrounded them to welcome them back to court. They entered the king's apartment. He was puzzled in whose favor to decide, for the little dogs which were presented to him by the 2 eldest were so nearly equal to each other in beauty, and they had already begun to dispute the right of succession, when their younger brother reconciled them by taking out of his pocket the acorn which the white cat had given him. He opened it immediately, and then everyone beheld a little dog lying upon cotton. It passed through a ring without touching any part of it. The prince placed it on the floor and it began directly to dance a saraband with castanets, as lightly as the most celebrated Spanish dancer. It was of 1,000 different colors. Its hair and its ears swept the ground. The king was dumbfounded, for it was impossible to find a word to say against the beauty of Tutu. Nevertheless, he was by no means inclined to resign the crown. The smallest fleur-de-lis in its circle was dearer to him than all the dogs in the universe. He told his children, therefore, that he was gratified by the trouble they had taken, but that they had succeeded so well in fulfilling his first request, he made them that he should test their ability again before he performed his promise. He therefore gave them a year to travel over land and sea in quest of a piece of cloth so fine that it would pass through the eye of a needle used to make Venetian point lace with. They were all 3 exceedingly chagrined to be obliged to go upon a new voyage of discovery. The 2 princes, whose dogs were less beautiful than that of the youngest, consented. Each took his own way without so many professions of friendship as before, for the turnspit had rather cooled their ardor. Our prince remounted his wooden horse, and without wishing to find other assistance than he might hope for from friendship of the white cat, he set out at full speed and returned to the castle where he had been so kindly received by her. He found all the doors open, the windows, the roofs, the towers, and the walls were all illuminated by 100,000 lamps, which produced a wonderful effect. The hands which had waited so well upon him advanced to meet him, and took the bridle of the excellent wooden horse, which they led to the stable, while the prince entered the white cat's apartments. She was lying in a little basket on a very neat mattress of white satin. She was in her morning cap and seemed low-spirited, but when she perceived the prince, she cut 1,000 capers and played as many gambols to testify her delight to him. "Whatever reason I had to hope you would return," said she to him, "I confess, son of a king, that I dared not flatter myself by indulging in it, and I am generally so unfortunate in matters that concern me that this is an agreeable surprise." The grateful prince caressed her 1,000 times. He recounted to her the success of his journey, which she knew perhaps better than he did, and that the king wanted a piece of cloth which could pass through the eye of a needle, that in truth he believed it was impossible to find such a thing, but that he had not hesitated to make the attempt, relying implicitly upon her friendship and assistance. White Cat, assuming a more serious air, told him it was a matter that demanded consideration, that fortunately there were some cats in her castle who spun exceedingly well, that she would put a claw to it herself, and forward the work as much as possible, so that he might rest contented without going further in search of what he would more readily find in her castle than any other place in the world. The hands appeared bearing flambeaux, and the prince, following them with the white cat, entered magnificent gallery running along the side of a large river, on which there was an astonishing display of fireworks. 4 cats were to be burnt there that had been tried and sentenced in due form. They were accused of having eaten the roast meat provided for the white cat's supper, her cheese, her milk, and even having conspired against her life. After this, a very nice supper was served, which gave the prince more gratification than the fireworks, for he was very hungry, and the wooden horse had brought him at such a pace that he had never ridden so hard before in his life. The following days were passed like those that had preceded them, in 1,000 various entertainments with which the ingenious White Cat regaled her guest. Our prince is probably the first mortal who ever found so much amusement amongst cats without any other society. It is true that White Cat was possessed of agreeable, sweet, and most universal talent. She was wiser than a cat is allowed to be. The prince was sometimes astonished at her knowledge. "No," said he, "it is not natural for you to possess all these wonderful qualities I discover in you. If you love me, charming pussy, explain to me by what miracle you are enabled to think and speak so perfectly that you might be elected as a member of the most famous Academy of Arts and Sciences." "Cease to question me, son of a king," said she to him. "I am not allowed to answer, and thou mayst carry thy conjectures as far as thou wilt without my contradicting thee. Let it suffice that I have always a velvet paw for thee, and that I take an affectionate interest in all that concerns thee." The second year slipped away as insensibly as the first. The prince could scarcely think of anything that the diligent hands did not instantly provide him with, whether books, jewels, pictures, antique medals. In short, he had but to say a want of a certain gem that is in the cabinet of the great Mogul, or of the king of Persia, or such a statue in Corinth or any part of Greece, and he saw it instantly before him, without knowing how it came or who brought it. This was not without its charms, and as a relaxation, it is sometimes very agreeable to see oneself the possessor of the finest treasures in the world. White Cat, who was ever watchful for the prince's welfare, warned him that the hour of departure was approaching, that he might make himself easy about the piece of cloth which he required, and that she had made a most wonderful one for him. She added that it was her intention this time to furnish him with an equipage worthy of his birth, and without waiting for his reply, she compelled him to look into the great courtyard of the castle. He saw in it an open caleche of gold, enameled flame color, with 1,000 gallant devices, which satisfied the mind as much as the eye. It was drawn by 12 horses as white as snow, 4 and 4 abreast, their harness being of flame-colored velvet, embroidered with diamonds and plated with gold. The caleche was lined to match, and 1,000 coaches, each with 8 horses, filled with noblemen of high bearing, very superbly attired, followed the caleche. There was also an escort of 1,000 bodyguards, whose uniforms were so covered with embroidery that you could not see the stuff that they were made of. It was a remarkable feature of this cavaleche that the portrait of White Cat was to be observed in every part of it, either in the devices on the caleche, or on the uniforms of the bodyguard, or attached by the riband of the doublets of those who formed the train, as if it were a new order with which she had decorated them. "Go," said she to the prince, "go and appear at the court of the king thy father in such sumptuous state that thy magnificence may make an impression upon him and prevent his again refusing to bestow on thee the crown thou deservest. Here is a walnut. Crack it but in his presence, and thou wilt find in it the piece of cloth thou hast asked me for." "Amiable White Cat," said he to her, "I protest to you that I am so penetrated by your bounties that, if you would consent, I should prefer passing my life here with you to all the grandeur which I have reason to expect elsewhere." "Son of a king," replied she, "I am convinced of the kindness of thy heart. It is a rare article amongst princes. They would be loved by everybody, yet not love anyone themselves. But thou art a proof that the rule has its exception. I give thee credit for the affection thou displayest for the little White Cat, that after all is good for nothing but to catch mice." The prince kissed her paw and departed. We should have some difficulty in believing the speed with which he traveled, if it were not already aware of the way in which the wooden horse had carried him in less than 2 days' distance, 500 leagues from the castle. So that, impelled by the same power, these other steeds traveled so swiftly that they were only 24 hours on the road, stopping nowhere till they reached the king's palace, to which the two elder brothers had already repaired, and not seeing their youngest, congratulated themselves on his negligence and whispered to each other, "Here's a piece of good luck. He is either dead or very ill. He will not be our rival in the important business which is about to be decided." They immediately displayed their cloths, which were in truth so fine that they could pass them through the eye of a very large needle, but not through that of a small one. And the king, very glad of this pretext for refusal, produced the needle he had previously selected, and which the magistrates by his order had brought out of the city treasury, wherein it had been carefully kept in the meanwhile. There was much murmuring at this objection. The friends of the princes, and particularly those of the eldest, for his cloth was of the finest texture, protested that it was a downright piece of chicanery, in which there was equal ingenuity and Normanism. The king's parasites contended that he was only bound by the conditions he had proposed. At length, to settle the matter, a fine flourish was heard of trumpets, kettle drums, and hautbois. It announced the arrival of our prince in all his pomp and paraphernalia. The king and his two other sons were all equally astonished at such great magnificence. After the prince had respectfully saluted his father and embraced his brothers, he took out of a box covered with rubies the walnut, which he cracked, expecting to find in it the boasted piece of cloth. But in lieu of it, there was a hazelnut. He cracked that also, and was surprised to see in it a cherry stone. Everybody looked at one another, and the king laughed in his sleeve and jeered at the notion of his son being credulous enough to believe he could bring a whole piece of cloth in a walnut. But why should he not have believed it when he had already given him a little dog that had come out of an acorn? He therefore cracked the cherry stone, which was filled with its kernel. A great murmur then arose from the apartment. Nothing was heard but the opinion that the young prince had been duped in this adventure. He made no answer to the raillery of the courtiers. He opened the kernel and found in it a grain of wheat, and in the grain of wheat a millet seed. Ah! In truth, he began to doubt, and muttered between his teeth, white cat, thou hast fooled me." At that moment he felt a cat's claw upon his hand, which gave him such a scratch that the blood came. He knew not whether the scratch was given to encourage or to dishearten him. Nevertheless, he opened the millet seed, and great was the astonishment of the whole company when he drew out of it a piece of cloth 400 ells in length, so wonderfully wrought that all the birds, beasts, and fishes were seen in their natural colors, with the trees, fruits, and plants of the earth, the rocks, curiosities, and shells of the ocean, the sun, the moon, the great and lesser stars and planets of the sky. There were also portraits of all the kings and other sovereigns at that time reigning in the world, with those of their wives, of their mistresses, of their children, of their subjects, not forgetting the teeniest little urchin, every one in his particular class of life accurately represented and dressed in the habit of his country. When the king saw this piece of cloth, he became as pale as the prince had become red in the confusion at having been so long finding it. The needle was produced, and the prince passed and repassed the cloth through its eye 6 times. The king and the 2 eldest princes looked on in sullen silence, except when the beauty and curiosity of the cloth forced them occasionally to acknowledge there was nothing that could be compared to it in the universe. The king heaved a deep sigh, and turning towards his children, "Nothing," said he, "could give me so much consolation in my old age as observing the deference paid by you to my wishes. I am therefore desirous to put your obedience to a new test. Go and travel for another year, and he who at the end of it brings back with him the most beautiful maiden shall marry her and be crowned king on his wedding day. It is besides necessary that my successor should marry, and I swear, I pledge my honor that I will no longer defer bestowing the reward I have promised." All the injustice of this proceeding fell upon our prince. The little dog and the piece of cloth were all worth 10 kingdoms rather than 1, but he was so well bred that he would not dispute the will of his father, and without hesitation he re-entered his caleche. All his train followed him, and he took the road back to his dear white cat. She knew the day and the moment he would arrive. All the way was strewn with flowers, thousands of vases of perfume smoked on all sides, and particularly within the castle. White Cat was seated on a Persian carpet under a pavilion of cloth and gold in a gallery from whence she could see him approach. He was received by the hands as he always was. All the cats climbed up into the gutters and welcomed him with desperate squalling. "So, son of the king," said White Cat to him, "thou hast returned once more without the crown." "Madam," he replied, "your bounties placed me in a position to gain it, but I am convinced that it would have given the king more pain to part with it than I could have received pleasure from its possession." "No matter," said she, "thou must neglect nothing to deserve it. I will assist thee in this matter, and as thou art bound to take back with thee a beautiful maiden to thy father's court, I will find one for thee who shall gain thee the prize. In the meanwhile, let us be merry. I have ordered a naval combat between my cats and the terrible rats of this country. My cats will perhaps be a little embarrassed, for they are afraid of the water, but otherwise they would have had too much the advantage, and one ought as much as possible to equalize the matters." The prince admired the prudence of Madame Puss. He praised her exceedingly and accompanied her to a terrace which overlooked the sea. The ships in which the cats were embarked were large pieces of cork on which they sailed conveniently enough. The rats had joined together several eggshells, and of these their navy consisted. The battle was cruelly obstinate. The rats flung themselves into the water and swam much better than the cats, so that they were victors and vanquished alternately 20 times. But Minagrobi, admiral of the feline fleet, reduced the rattish race to the greatest despair. He devoured the general of their forces, an old rat of great experience who had been around the world 3 times in capital ships, in which he was neither captain nor common sailor, but simply a lickspit. White Cat would not permit the utter destruction of all these poor creatures. She was an acute politician and calculated that if there were no more rats or mice left in the country, her subjects would live in a state of idleness, which might become highly prejudicial to her. And the prince passed this year as he had the 2 preceding, that is to say, in hunting, fishing, or chess, at which White Cat played exceedingly well. He could not help occasionally questioning her anew as to the miraculous power by which she was enabled to speak. He asked her whether she was a fairy or whether she'd been transformed into a cat, but as she never said anything by what she chose, she also never made answers that were not perfectly agreeable to her, and consequently her replies consisted of a number of little words which signified nothing in particular, so that he was clearly perceived she was not inclined to make him a partaker of her secret. Nothing runs away faster than time passed without trouble or sorrow, and if Cat had not been careful to remember that the day when it was necessary the prince should return to court, it is certain that he would have absolutely forgotten it. She informed him on the evening preceding it that it only depended on himself to take home with him one of the most beautiful princesses in the world, that the hour to destroy the fatal work of the fairies had at length arrived, and for that purpose he must resolve to cut off her head and her tail and fling them into the fire. "I," exclaimed the prince, "Blanchette, my love, I be so barbarous as to kill you? Ah, you would doubtless try my heart, but rest assured it is incapable of forgetting the love and gratitude it owes you." "No, son of a king," continued she, "I do not suspect thee of ingratitude. I know thy worth. It is neither thou nor I who in this affair can control our destiny. Do as I bid thee. We shall both of us begin to be happy, and on the faith of a cat of reputation and honor, thou wilt acknowledge that I am truly thy friend." The tears came several times into the eyes of the young prince. At the mere thought of being obliged to cut off the head of his little kitten, so pretty and amiable, he continued to say all the most tender things that he could think of in order to induce her to spare him such a trial. She persisted in replying that she desired to die by his hand, and that it was the only means of preventing his brother's obtaining the crown. In a word, she pressed him so earnestly that in a tremble he drew his sword and, with a faltering hand, cut off the head and tail of his dearly beloved cat. The next moment he beheld the most charming transformation that can be imagined. The body of White Cat increased in size and changed suddenly into that of a young maiden, one that cannot be described. There has never been any so perfect. Her eyes enraptured all hearts, and her sweetness held them captive. Her form was majestic, her carriage noble and modest, her spirit gentle, her manners engaging. In fact, she exceeded in everything that was ever most amiable. The prince, at her sight, was so struck with surprise, and that surprise was so agreeable that he fancied himself enchanted. He could not speak nor open his eyes wide enough to look at her. Tongue-tied, he was unable to express his astonishment, but it was still greater when he saw an extraordinary number of lords and ladies enter the apartment, who, each having his or her catskin flung over their shoulders, advanced and threw themselves at the feet of their queen and testified their delight at beholding her restored to a natural form. She received them with marks of affection that sufficiently indicated the goodness of her heart, and after passing a short time in the circle, she desired them to leave her alone with the prince, to whom she spoke as follows. Think not, my lord, that I have been always a cat, nor that my birth is an obscure one in the eyes of men. My father was a king of 6 kingdoms. She went out of the castle. The prince gave her his hand. She got into the chariot with him. It was much more magnificent than those she had previously provided him. The rest of the equipage corresponded with it to such an extent that the horses were all shod with emeralds, the nails being diamonds, with such a thing that perhaps never has been seen except on that occasion. I shall not repeat the agreeable conversation that took place between the queen and the prince on their journey. If her beauty was matchless, her mind was no less so, and the young prince was equally perfect, so that they interchanged all sorts of charming ideas. When they reached the neighborhood of the castle in which the prince was to meet his 2 elder brothers, the queen entered a little rock of crystal, the points of which were ornamented with gold and rubies. It was completely surrounded by curtains, in order that no one should see it, and carried by very handsome young men, superbly attired. The prince remained in the chariot. He perceived his brothers walking with 2 princesses, who were exceedingly beautiful. As soon as they recognized him, they advanced to receive him, and inquired if he had brought a lady with him. He replied that he had been so unfortunate throughout his journey as to have met with none but very ugly ones, and that the only rarity he had brought back with him was a little white cat. They began to laugh at his simplicity. "A cat," they exclaimed. "Are you afraid the mice will eat up our palace?" The prince admitted that he had been rather unwise in selecting such a present for their father, and thereupon they each took the road to the city. The elder princes rode with their princesses in open carriages, all of gold and azure. Their horses' heads were adorned with plumes of feather and aigrettes. Nothing could be more brilliant than this cavalcade. Our young prince followed them, and behind him came the crystal rock, which everybody gazed at with wonder. The courtiers hastened to inform the king that the 3 princes were coming. "Do they bring with them beautiful ladies?" asked the king. "It is impossible to find any that could surpass them," was the answer, which appeared to displease him. The 2 princes eagerly ascended the palace stairs with their wonderful princesses. The king received them graciously and could not decide which deserved the prize. He looked at his youngest son and said to him, "Have you returned alone this time?" "Your Majesty will perceive in this rock a little white cat," replied the prince, "that mews so sweetly and has such velvet paws, you will be delighted with it." The king smiled and went to open the rock himself, but as soon as he approached it, the queen, by means of a spring, made it fly in pieces and appeared like the sun after it had been some time hidden in the clouds. Her fair hair fell in loose ringlets over her shoulders down to her feet. She was crowned with flowers. Her gown was of thin white gauze lined with rose-colored. She rose and made a profound curtsy to the king, who could not resist exclaiming in the excess of his admiration, "Behold the incomparable beauty who deserves the crown." "My liege," she said to him, "I come not to deprive you of a throne you fill so worthily. I was born the heiress of 6 kingdoms. Permit me to offer one to you, and to give one to each of your eldest sons. I ask of you no other recompense than your friendship and this young prince for my husband. 3 kingdoms will be quite enough for us." The king and all the court joined in shouts of joy and astonishment. The marriage was celebrated immediately, as well as those of the other 2 princes. And the court consequently passed several months in entertainments and pleasures of every description. Finally, each couple departed to reign over their own dominions. The beautiful white cat immortalized herself and hers, as much by her goodness and liberality as by her rare talent and beauty. The youthful prince was fortunate to find beneath the cat's skin an illustrious fair, worthy of adoration and inclined the throne her friendship won for him to share. That's it, the end.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mia. That was fantastic. Up next, we've got Crystal here.
Yeah. Okay. I've decided to share a story. It's funny because I was always curious about. I'm half Chinese, and part of my heritage revolves around like Chinese zodiacs. We're always celebrated based on our zodiac. It's actually I'm not sure if my family is like extremely spiritual or like really celebrates kind of like myths, or like it's not very active in, I guess, in my family. But every now and then, like, I'll say something and then my mom will say like, "Oh, that's like such a horse, like you're such a horse sometimes," which is when I was born in 1990, and that was the year of the horse. Or like compatibility with like partners, you know, the first question is always what is their zodiac sign. So I never knew where the story came from. I never knew why these animals were chosen. And in typical fashion, you always have to sort of research your Chinese heritage because it's not often talked about. You have to do all the work. So I did it recently. I was recounting this story to Steph on our vacation, and I said, I think it's something about a race, or like, you know, some of these animals are really clever and how they cross this river in order to win the race, in order to find their placement in the zodiac. And he encouraged me to like read the story, and by doing that I like finally confirmed what the story was. So I'm going to read to you The Great Race. And we'll bring up a little zodiac cycle so that you can sort of follow along. Yeah. Great.
Oh, wait. No. That's it.
So the Chinese zodiac is a cycle of 12 years, where each year is represented by one of the 12 animals that are seen in this photo. There exists a story in Chinese mythology of a great race that decided which animals made it into the zodiac and in what order. There, I guess, are 2 main variations of this story, but the one that I'll tell today is surrounds the narrative through the Jade Emperor, who is the ruler of all gods within Chinese mythology, and he's the one who hosted the race. Also, I'll just say as a little disclaimer, this is a translation, so I think the narrative of this translation is a little bit disjointed at times from maybe what we're used to in a conventional storytelling. A long time ago in China lived the Jade Emperor. It was his birthday. He wanted to measure time to know how old he was. The emperor called on all the animals and decided to have a race to determine a name for each year of the Chinese zodiac. The great race loomed just on the horizon, and the cat and the rat were best of friends. Together, the 2 of them hatched a plan to ride the ox across the river together. They knew the large and hardy ox was accustomed to crossing rivers and would likely finish first. At the start of the race, the 2 animals slipped atop the ox. Being rather thick-headed, the ox was oblivious to the 2 animals atop him. But, as the cat and the rat rode atop the ox, the rat jolted abruptly forward. The sudden force sent the cat flying off the ox and into the river. The cat let out a piercing hiss directed at the rat, but by then it was too late, and the ox, with the rat atop, was already too far ahead of the cat. Even to this day, cat still holds a grudge against rat. This is why Cat hates water and hunts Rat every time he sees him. The ox lumbered towards the finish line. The ox was going to come first. Suddenly, the rat leapt from Ox's back and crossed the finish line first. The ox crossed the finish line soon after. However, the ox was too composed a sort to make a big fuss about coming in second. Water splashed forth from the river. The tiger had burst from beneath the water, his coat sopping wet. The water had weighed the proud tiger down, but the well-muscled tiger pushed forth in spite of the burden, hind legs rippling with tense firmness. His huge paw prints bore down on the damp, muddy shore, and with one final fierce stride, the tiger claimed the third spot in the zodiac. The Jade Emperor watched as the trio of rat, ox, and tiger crossed the finish. He applauded them. They would be the first 3 animals of the zodiac. The rabbit stood perched upon a rock in the river. He was only lagging slightly behind the tiger. River water lapped up at his paws. The rabbit let out soft huffs and heaves. He had been trying desperately to keep up with the tiger. Despite the rabbit's small stature, he had kept pace, leaping from one rock to another so he could quickly cross the river. The rabbit noticed a long trail of rocks jutted up from the riverbed. As worry overtook the rabbit hastened his motions, pulling back hurriedly on his strong hind legs. The rabbit feared that if he did not pick up his pace, another animal might seize the 4th spot from him. Suddenly, the rabbit slipped, tumbling back first into the murky waters of the river. The rabbit's thoughts began to race. Would he ever even be able to finish in time? A moment later, the rabbit's eyes widened. A log was floating slowly by. Nearly leaping up from the river, the rabbit sped into a wild puddle, water flying up around him. He pressed both paws onto the log, clinging on as tightly as he could muster. Alas, the log was barely moving, bobbing complacently in the water. Suddenly, a gust stirred thickly in the air, sending the log hurtling down the river. The rabbit's heart throbbed in slow motion as the log drifted towards the shore where the finish line was. The rabbit's pulse gradually slowed, and as he neared the shore, a deep-seated feeling of relief overtook him. The rabbit peered backwards as he floated close to the shore. No other animals in sight. The rabbit hopped right across the finish line. The rabbit did not stop as he passed the Jade Emperor. The Emperor was smiling at the rabbit with a generous grin. The rabbit passed rice paddies as he made his way towards the forest, reaching a shaded and secluded thicket. The rabbit collapsed into a tiny heap of white fur. A mix of relief and exhilaration had seeped through his being, replacing the disappointment he had felt about only getting 4th place. Over the finish line, the dragon soared swiftly, moving in a majestic aerial stride as it shimmied through the clouds, his long tail streaming and lashing about the sky, wind racing past him. As the dragon made his rapid descent, the clouds seemed to part. The Jade Emperor stood awaiting the great creature. Why has the dragon not come in first place? He wondered. When the Jade Emperor addressed the dragon, he began to explain the circumstances that had befallen him. Exalted Jade Emperor, on my way I saw several villagers that were in trouble. A fire had ignited amidst the crops, and they had been surrounded in a circle of blaze. I knew that my spot in the zodiac was on the line, but I could not stand by and watch. To put out the flames, I used my breath to extinguish the blaze, snuffing it out like a flickering candle. I had to be careful, though. I did not want to also sweep the villagers up in this gale of my own creation. I also saw a tiny rabbit in the river clinging to a log, so I used my breath to push it to the shore. The Jade Emperor smiled again. He was well acquainted with the dragon's nature. He was not disappointed in him. As the dragon and the Jade Emperor spoke, the horse was in the midst of galloping across the river, splashing up water as her hooves moved like beating pistons through the ankle-deep water, beads of mist silhouetting her strong equestrian form. The horse burst from the river. Only a few strides separated her from the finish line, but something slithered through the grass. From the grass, the snake surged out, approaching from behind the horse's hooves. Overtaken by shock, the horse recoiled, leaping backwards. A high neigh exited the horse's mouth, hooves thrown up towards the sky. With a quick slither, the snake crossed the finish line. The Jade Emperor watched the snake move past the finish line, still smiling. He did not judge the snake. The snake had merely been clever. The horse lowered her long face, a tinge of shame lingering in her dark, beady eyes as she stepped slowly across the finish line. Fear had cost her the 6th spot. Her legs, which moments ago had carried her in an untamed gallop, were now locked in slow, shaky steps, which barely left imprints on the dirt. Back in the river, the monkey, the rooster, the sheep all floated atop a raft. which the rooster had found resting in the opposite shore, conveniently unclaimed by anyone. Together, the three of them worked furiously, using lengthy branches as makeshift paddles. The sticks would often get caught in tangles of unwieldy underwater weeds, which weaved up from the riverbed, but the three of them did not stop paddling, severing the leafy vines with forceful branch strokes. When the rooster, the monkey, and the sheep reached the river's shore, they let the sheep cross first, claiming eighth place. The sheep had been so comforting and formed such harmonious bonds with them that the others felt it was only right to let the sheep claim the eighth place. If the sheep had not helped foster these bonds, they may not have all made it to the finish line at all. The monkey claimed the ninth place, and the rooster took the 10th. Coat sopping wet, the dog scrambled across the finish line next, panting as he did so, canine tongue flapping from his open mouth. The dog was an inept swimmer, but because he had not bathed for some time, he had overindulged in the river, frolicking without care in the water. The sun sat high in the sky today and had heated the water, making it pleasant to bathe in, and thus the dog claimed the 11th place in the race. By the finish line stood the Jade Emperor. 11 animals had already crossed. There's only one spot remaining in the zodiac now. What animal will conclude the race? The Jade Emperor wondered. Over the horizon, a loud, exhausted oink sounded. The pig waddled towards the finish line, pink skin caked in dense layers of dirt, sniffling snout pasted brown with mud. Yet the pig moved at a surprisingly swift gait, little feet locked in a tiny cyclical gallop. The Jade Emperor gave the pig a sharp glance as he crossed the finish line. How has one such as you, who possesses such surprising speed, fallen so far behind? He asked. The pig snorted as he readied himself to speak. Sorry, exalted Jade Emperor. I was hungry and couldn't resist stopping to gobble something up. I felt sleepy after eating and couldn't help myself. The Jade Emperor smiled again as he peered down at the dirt-covered pig. The race had concluded. The pig collapsed onto his side, lasping back into sleep. Snorts that sounded like snores sounded from the pig's rotund, heavy form. The 12 animals of the zodiac had been decided, and so concluded the great race.
Awesome. Thank you. Jeanette, you will be our final story for today.
Okay, excellent. What fun. Great. Okay, so the story I'm doing, it's called The Oak Tree. This is a way to introduce people to the things that we know about Holland. Everybody knows about tulips, about wooden shoes, and about the fact that Holland is below sea level. So this story, it doesn't have any tulips in it. That's all I'll say there. All right. In years long gone, too many for the almanac to tell of, or for clocks and watches to measure, millions of good fairies came down from the sun and went into the earth. There they changed themselves into roots and leaves and became trees. There were many kinds of these as they covered the earth, but the pine and birch, ash and oak were the chief ones that made Holland. The fairies that lived in the trees bore the name of moss maidens, or tree trintjes, which is the Dutch pet name for Kate or Catherine. The oak was the favorite tree, for people then lived on acorns, which they ate roasted, boiled, or mashed, or made into meal from which something like bread is kneaded and baked. With oak bark, men tanned hides and made leather, and from its timber, boats and houses. Under its branches near the trunk, people laid their sick, hoping for help from the gods. Beneath the oak boughs, warriors took oaths to be faithful to their lords. Women made promises, or wives joined hand in hand around its girth, hoping to have beautiful children. Up among its leafy branches, the new babies lay before they were found in the cradle by their sisters and brothers. To make a young child grow up to be strong and healthy, mothers drew them through a split sapling or a young tree. Even more wonderful, as medicine for the country itself, the oak had power to heal. The new land sometimes suffered from a disease called fall, or fall, to fall over. When sick with the fall, the ground sunk. Then people, houses, churches, barns, and cattle all went down out of sight and were lost forever in a flood of water. But the oak, with its mighty roots, held the soil firm. Stories of dead cities that had tumbled beneath the waves, and of the famous forest of reeds covering 100 villages, which disappeared in one night, were known only too well. Under the birch tree, lovers met to plight their vows, and on its smooth bark cut the figure of two hearts joined in one. In summer, the forest furnished shade, and in winter, warmth from the fire. In the springtime, the new leaves were a wonder, and in autumn, the pigs grew fat on the acorns that had dropped on the ground. So, for thousands of years, when men made their home in the forest and wanted nothing else, the trees were sacred. But by and by, when cows came into the land and sheep and horses multiplied, more open ground was needed for pasture, grain fields, and meadows. Fruit trees bearing apples and pears, peaches and cherries were planted, and grass, wheat, rye, and barley were grown. Then, instead of the dark woods, men liked to have their gardens and orchards open to the sunlight. Still, the people were very poor, and all they had on their bare feet were rough bits of hard leather tied on through their toes, though most of them went barefooted. The forests had to be cut down. Men were so busy with the axe that in a few years the woodland was gone. Then the new Holland, with its people and red-roofed houses, with its chimneys and windmills and dikes and storks, took the place of the old Holtland of many trees. Now there was a good man, a carpenter, very skillful with his tools, who so loved the oak that he gave himself and his children the name of Eik, which is Dutch for oak. When before his neighbors and friends, according to the beautiful Dutch custom, he called his youngest born child to lay the cornerstone for his new house, he bestowed upon her before them all the name of Nieltje, which we say Nelly, Nieltje van Eik. The carpenter daddy continued to mourn over the loss of the forests. He even shed tears, fearing lest by and by there should not be one oak tree left in the whole country. Moreover, he was frightened at the thought that the new land made by pushing back the ocean and building dikes might sink down again and go back to the fishes. In such a case, all the people, the babies and their mothers, men, women, horses and cattle would be drowned. The Dutch folks were a little too hasty, he thought, in winning their acres from the sea. One day, while sitting on his doorstep, brooding sorrowfully, a moss maiden and a tree elf appeared, skipping along hand in hand. They came up to him and told him that his ancestral oak had a message for him. Then they laughed and ran away. Van Eyck went into the forest and stood under the grand old oak tree which his fathers loved and which he would allow none to cut down. Looking up, the leaves of the tree rustled, and one big branch seemed to sweep near to him, and then it whispered in his ear, "Do not mourn, for your descendants, even many generations hence, shall see greater things than you have witnessed. I and my fellow oak trees shall pass away, but the sunshine shall be spread over the land and make it dry. Then instead of falling down like acorns from the trees, more and better food shall come up from the earth. Where green fields now spread and the cities grow, where forests were, we shall come to life again and in another form. When most needed, we shall furnish you and your children's children with warmth, comfort, fire, light, and wealth. No need for you to fear for the land, that it will fall, for even while living, we and all the oak trees that are left and all the birch, beech, and pine trees shall stand on our heads for you. We shall hold up your houses, lest they fall into the ooze, and we shall walk and run over our heads, and you shall walk and run over our heads. As truly as when rooted in the soil, we will do this. Believe what we tell you and be happy. We shall turn ourselves upside down for you." "I cannot see how these things could be," said Van Eyck. "Fear not, my promise will endure." The leaves of the branch rustled for a moment, and then all was still, until the moss maiden and Trintje, the tree elf, again hand in hand, as they tripped along merrily, appeared to him. "We shall help you and get our friends, the elves, to do the same. Now take some oak wood and saw off 2 pieces, each a foot long. See that they are well dried. Then set them on the kitchen table tonight when you go to bed. After saying this and looking at each other and laughing, just as girls do, they disappeared. Pondering on what all this might mean, Van Eyck went to his woodshed and sawed off the oak timber. At night, after his wife had cleared off the supper table, he laid the foot-long pieces in their place. When Van Eyck woke up in the morning, he recalled his dream, and before he was even dressed, he hurried to the kitchen. There on the table lay a pair of neatly made wooden shoes. Not a sign of tools or shavings could be seen, but the clean wood and pleasant aroma made him glad. Then he glanced again at the wooden shoes. He found them perfectly smooth, both inside and out. They had heels at the bottom and were nicely pointed at the toes, and altogether were very inviting to the foot. He tried them on and found that they fitted him exactly. He tried to walk on the kitchen floor, which his wife kept scrubbed and polished and sprinkled with clean white sand with broomstick ripples scored in the layers. But for Van Eyck, it was like walking on ice. After slipping and balancing himself as if on a tightrope and nearly breaking his nose against the wall, he took off the wooden shoes and kept them off while inside the house. However, when he went outdoors, he found his new shoes very light, pleasant to the feet, and easy to walk in. It was not so much like trying to skate as it had been in the kitchen. At night in his dreams, he saw two elves come through the window into the kitchen. One, a kabouter, dark and rough, and he had a box of tools. The other, a light elf, seemed to be the guide. The kabouter at once got out his saw, hatchet, auger, knife, and smoothing plane. At first, the two elves seemed to be quarreling as to who should be boss. Then they settled down quietly to work. The kabouter took the wood and shaped it on the outside. Then he hollowed out from the inside of it a pair of shoes, which the elf smoothed and polished. Then one elf put his little feet in them and tried to dance, but he only slipped on the smooth floor and flattened his nose. But the other fellow pulled the nose straight again, so it was all right. They waltzed together upon the wooden shoes and then took them off, jumped out the window, and ran away. When Van Eyck put the wooden shoes on, he found that out in the fields, in the mud and on the soft soil, and in sloppy places, this sort of footgear was just the thing. They did not sink in the mud, and man's feet were comfortable even after hours of labor. They did not draw his feet, and they kept out the water far better than leather possibly could. When Van Eyck's vrouw and the children saw how happy Daddy was, they each one wanted a pair. Then they asked him what he called them. Klompen, he said in good Dutch, and klompen, or klomps, they are to this day. I'll make a fortune out of this, said Van Eyck. I'll set up a klompwinkel, which is Dutch for a wooden shoe store. I will set up a klompwinkel at once. So going out to the blacksmith shop in the village, he had the man who pounded iron fashion for him on his anvil a set of tools exactly like those used by the kabouter and the elf, which he had seen in his dream. Then he hung out a sign marked wooden blocks for shoes. He made klompen for the little folks just out of the nursery, for boys and girls, for grown men and women, and for all who walked out of doors in the street or in the fields. So klompen came to be the fashion in all the country places. It was good manners when you went into a house to take off your wooden shoes and leave them at the door. Even in the towns and cities, ladies wore wooden slippers, especially when walking or working in the garden. Klompen also set the fashion for soft, warm socks and stockings made from sheep's wool. Soon 1,000 needles were clicking to put a soft cushion between one's soles and toes and the wood. Women knitted even while they walked to market or gossiped on the streets. The klompenwinkels, or the shops of the shoe carpenters, were seen in every village. When rich beyond his daydreams, Van Eyck had another joyful night vision. The next day, he wore a smiling countenance. Everybody who met him on the street saluted him and asked in a neighborly way, "Good morning, meneer Blijmoedig," which is Mr. Cheerful. "Good morning, meneer Blijmoedig. How do you sail today?" That's the way the Dutch talk, not how do you do, but in their watery country, it's how do you sail? Or else, hoe gaat het al? Which is, how does it go with you? Then Van Eyck told his dream. It was this. The moss maiden and Trintje, the wood elf, came to him again at night and danced. They were lively and happy. "What now?" asked the dreamer smilingly of his two visitors. He had hardly got the question out of his mouth when in walked a kabouter, all smutty with blacksmith work. In one hand, he grasped his toolbox. In the other, It was a big lump of iron set in a frame with ropes to pull it up and let it fall down with a thump. What is that? Asked Van Eyck. It's a hay, a pile driver, said the kabouter, showing him how to use it. When men say to you on the street tomorrow, how do you sail? Laugh at them, said the Moss Maiden, herself also laughing. Yes, and now you can tell people how to build cities with mighty churches, with lofty towers, with high houses like those in other lands. Take the trees, trim the branches off, sharpen the tops, turn them upside down, and pound them deep into the ground. Did not the ancient oak promise that trees would be turned upside down for you? Did they not say that you could walk on top of them? By this time, Van Eyck had asked so many questions and kept the elves so long that the Moss Maiden peeped anxiously through the window. Seeing the day breaking, she and Trintje and the kabouter flew away so as not to be petrified by the sunrise. I will make another fortune out of this also, said the happy man, who next morning was saluted as Meneer Blijdschap, Mr. Joyful. At once Van Eyck set up a factory for making pile drivers, sending men into the woods who chose the tall, straight trees. He had their branches cut off. Then he sharpened the trunks at one end, and those were driven by the pile driver down far and deep into the ground. So a foundation as good as stone was made in the soft, spongy soil, and well-built houses arose up by the thousands. Even the lofty walls of churches stood firm. The spires were unshaken in the storm. Sorry about the noise, guys. Old Holland did not have fertile soil like France, or vast flocks of sheep producing wool, like England, or armies of weavers, as in the Belgic lands. Yet soon there rose large cities with splendid mansions and town halls, as high towards heaven as the cathedrals and tops in other lands, which had rock for foundation, where brick churches rose up into the air. On top of the forest trees, driven deep into the sand and clay, dams and dikes were built that kept out the ocean. So instead of the old 2,000 square miles, there were in that realm 12,000 square miles, rich in green fields and cattle. And then for all the boys and girls that travel in this land of quaint customs, Holland was, and is a delight. That's it. Yeah.
Woo!
That was awesome.
Suddenly company arrived downstairs and it's like an echo chamber. Was it really loud for you guys?
Oh, it wasn't that bad. No, not at all. Yeah, just hear little like snippets sort of like pop in every now and again.
Okay, it really distracted me. It's like, whoa. Anyway.
For sure. It's always worse in your ear than it is in the other Zoom, you know?
Okay.
Well, thanks so much everybody for sharing your stories. It was really wonderful to hear everybody's folk or fairy tales. I think I'm all right to just sort of jump straight into the discussion if everybody else is, just because I'm interested to see. So the three questions I sort of just threw them up in the chat there, but yeah, the three questions are basically sort of what are the similarities, what are the differences, and then what's the value to continuing to tell these stories today. I guess the one thing that kind of struck me with a lot of the stories. For me personally, sorry everybody. Yeah, what struck me is this sort of connection to nature. Really, like each of the stories that were told has like. For me, there were mine was actually the furthest removed from nature. But even in the last story I told, you had those fishes sort of coming up and speaking to the boy, right? And in other in other fairy tales that were told, there was like a hare that sort of like hunts a hunter. In Mia's story, you had like the dogs and the cats who were interacting.
I don't think I was supposed to know who that person was.
Oh, it's okay. It's all right. Anyway, I'm gonna leave it there because I think I just have to go to the door really quick. But I just was noting that there were like natural elements that popped up in all the stories. Yeah. Just kind of talking about the similarities and differences. I'll be right back, everybody. I'm so sorry.
Absolutely. I love that there are magical creatures in all the stories in some way or other, right? So the animals and the people and elves and fairies and dwarves and all of that appear in all the stories everywhere, which is beautiful. Um, and that it so happens that today's stories covered like quite a base as far as like going from poor folk to kings and queens. We had quite the gamut of that, which was also great. Are we going to wait for Stefan? Yeah, we should wait for Stefan.
The dogs are so barky on our end. Sorry.
I loved watching Mia. I loved your dog getting on the bed.
Yeah.
It was like, okay, if you're not going to pay attention to me, I'm going on the bed. I got this idea that maybe that's usually not allowed, but paying attention.
No, actually, this is the bed that he sleeps in with me. It's not even my bed. It's my little brother's bed, but he doesn't live here, so I just.
Sorry about that, everybody. Yeah, sorry to kind of halt the conversation there. Anyway, yeah, we're catch me up to speed.
We were
just talking about dogs.
Yeah,
okay.
we were talking about dogs. Actually,
Amazing.
I think the dog came perfectly in your frame, Mia, because in the story they were talking about finding the dog, and we were like, the dog's right there, it's behind you.
We've got to search for like the perfect dog. We're like that one right
That's
there.
really good.
And even Jeanette, in the top of your frame on the right hand side, you've got that little fairy. And yeah, the second you were like, and the fairies like all came down into the forest. We're like, there they are.
I got that from Rosemary Dunsmore.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, well, hey, I loved it. There were like these, little lovely nods to your stories, just like in the frame during the story for both of you, which is really, really nice.
It was really nice to have visual effects there for you guys too. I hadn't even thought of that. What a great idea when you're reading a story to have something to look at.
Well, I mean, the thing for me, I mean, it was funny because at first I was sort of, when I first had the thought to do these folk stories, or like mine are more like moral tales, right? Like moral stories, geared for children. But I remembered, and I had these vivid images. I don't know if Mia, you said that your story you remembered from your childhood. Those stories for me, I also remembered from my childhood. I mean, you saw that image of like the tailor with the scissors. Like that left such an impression on my like 5-year-old brain. It's never left. So much so that when I thought of this, I was like, those stories I have to find. Like I'm sure my mother has them, or my grandmother has like a book of these. Somewhere along the line, those were like given to other unfortunate children at some point, but I managed to find them online, and so I just thought, man, like the images are just so striking and like classic in that, like at least in German culture. I was like, I really want to have an opportunity to show them.
I knew those stories as a kid as well. The same, I was told the same stories, so I knew them too. It's like, oh, I remember that one.
Now, I'm curious, did you have any, like similar images or?
Oh yeah, there's German in my family as well. So there was always sort of a conglomeration of all that kind of stuff coming into the family. So there were German tales, Dutch tales, Belgian, so.
Right. Yeah, it strikes me like I thought like, wow, those Grimm's tales that like many of us are sort of like partly familiar with, maybe through like Disney versions of them. Or yes.
Good old.
But like, yeah, those original versions, like I know people when they first hear them are like, "Whoa, that's a lot more gruesome than the Disney versions, right? Like the very sort of like toned down versions." And I thought, oh well, those are maybe like outliers, or strangely, the Grimm's brothers were just sort of like really strange dudes writing crazy children's stories. But like, no, Heinrich Hoffmann was also like a writer kind of around that same period of time. Like this version these stories that I read were like published in the 1850s. Yeah, and my grandmother gave me another book, and I was leafing through it. It's in German, so like I was having a little bit of trouble translating. But yeah, they also have a similar sort of vibe. So I mean, if we're talking about differences in terms of stories, I think I don't know. There's a well, actually, even in yours, Mia, there is like a bit of a sort of what's it, not insensitivity, but desensitization to violence. Like there's that one moment where they're like, oh, and these three cats are strung up off to dinner, and like just
Or like cutting the cat's head and the tail.
yeah.
And like how it's juxtaposed with like this beauty that arises from like such a grim image. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's not all bad.
Yeah, I don't know. So I'm not sure. Like Jeanette, your story was like quite a beautiful story. I don't know if there's that same sort of desensitization to that violence, or if there are.
No, not in that one. Not in that particular
No.
one. No. I mean, yeah, nature is so strong in it, right? I'm really drawn to that one because of the sort of the idea of nature adapting and transforming. Transformation actually was in a lot of the stories as well, but that that the nature itself is willing to transform, and it's kind of an interesting thing for us to think about today. And how far do we want to let nature transform before it's run out of options?
But yeah, we take away all its options, right? Yeah.
Yes, that's right. But yeah.
Well, it's almost like a desensitization to like gentrification. Like when I think of like this moss maiden telling you like this is what you should do so that you can like
Yeah.
pro development of your like community. Like I've never thought of it in that sense before because we're in Toronto and like we compare that to like I don't know
Yeah.
capitalism, I guess.
Right.
Well, I mean, the development, I don't know if you've missed that part of it, but the reason for the development is because Holland is below sea level. So it's sinking into the water. So it was like a suggestion of how to keep, how to be able to build, how to create land out of water, basically.
But I guess like the striking imagery was more like the oak tree being turned upside down so that it can be like a giant skyscraper,
Right. I mean, they actually, they literally drove piles into the ground to create, that was like literally done, to create a solid land base to be able to build on, and then build the skyscrapers on top of that. But yeah, you're right. It's wild image, weird image. Yeah.
Yeah, super strange. I mean, like I had this like image all of a sudden of like walls being built like with like tree sort of
Yeah, it's weird. I know.
yeah, just sort of all like in a row.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, that's kind of interesting. You like fashion them into things and turn them upside down and just
Easy.
yeah, so simple. And then my mind starts going to like, well, like in like pre sort of industrial era, like how do you like figure out how do you do that without your like cranes, and it's like wow. Then I'm like wait, just forget about this. Who cares how they did it? Just listen.
Well, they explained it away with the pile driver, right?
Yeah.
Pile driver. That's all you need to know.
Yeah. So I mean, any other sort of like major sort of differences or similarities or things that people found like interesting between the stories that they noticed?
I thought it was really interesting because like when I was trying to find the story because I couldn't find my actual physical storybook, so I had to like Google white cat fairy tale because those were the details I remembered.
Yeah.
And I hadn't realized that it was written by a woman, which isn't something you find for a lot of these fairy tales. Like they're usually published by men, and I thought that was interesting because it had always stood out for me even as a kid as being different from the other fairy tales even. Just it had like a different touch to it.
Yeah, true. I wonder like if there's sort of history behind the Great Race story, like where that like it almost feels like it's like when like the German fairy tales, for example, or like the French tale, you feel like oh yeah, there's like an author who we can like trace it back to. Certain stories you feel like are so sort of timeless, you're not quite sure what the origin, right? And then it's just a matter of like who was the telling that particular version of it, right?
Yeah.
But yeah.
I also thought it was interesting, and Crystal, you mentioned with yours too, that it was in translation. All of ours were in translation. And I thought, that is an interesting, I actually went through mine and made some changes before I read it because I couldn't stand it. It was a really typical Dutch translation into English where grammatically a lot of, the structure is the wrong way around. But it is interesting. And for Mia, that the heightened language in that one, really heightened language, it was,
Yeah.
it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's also nice. Like, I appreciate it when like the translator does their best to. I mean, it's an extra layer of work when you have like a rhyming scheme you have to try to follow. Like in mine, right? All of a sudden, yeah, you're looking at like, oh my God, how do I rhyme this stanza or that line with this line? There's always that added sort of element.
Quite a skill. That's quite a skill. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. To hit the meter as well as the rhyming structure, you're like, and then achieve the correct sort of like sense of the line. Yeah, quite challenging. So yeah, that's true. All of these are in sort of English translations, right? Also, like it's like neat to see the symbolism, right? Like certain images, I mean, which are different, but each story you sort of like see certain like bits of like cultural imagery or symbolism popping up, like the Jade Emperor. I think about like your jade bracelet kind of thing, like that sort of as a symbol. Yeah, just sort of seeing these like little bits and pieces, like the fairies and like the wood elves and stuff like that. These like images which are like so iconic to each culture, like weaving their way into each of the stories is quite fascinating. Yeah, I guess I'm also curious, like what do you feel is the value of continuing to tell these stories? And I mean, each story maybe has its own, like they're not the reasons won't all be the same. Like each one kind of has its own value in and of itself. Like I know for my stories, they're very clear, although maybe misplaced. Like to tell children a moral lesson: don't suck your thumb, don't have your head up in the clouds. So like they're and so I guess the intended meaning of the story was like, well, this naughty behavior, don't do that, or else XYZ will happen to you. So I'm not sure how I mean, for me, I don't think it actually helped to stop me from sucking my thumb, or like that kind of thing. So even though I was like terrified of this like Taylor man, it didn't actually do much for me. So whether or not there was like a value to telling that story to me is like, okay.
You didn't believe it.
yeah, exactly. I was like, yeah, it doesn't seem quite. I know better than this. So yeah, I don't know what are your thoughts in terms of like the value of continuing to tell or listen to these stories?
I think they're all incredibly informative. Like it's like the Zodiac one, obviously. I mean, it really tells us a story of why those animals are where they are, which I didn't know anything about. So I love that, and I think continued to hand that on is incredibly important. But any stories coming from those who came before, from our ancestors, are so important to keep alive. It's a connection to how we formed into who we are now, and they don't have to literally mean the same thing to us now. We can still draw from them a real sense of history and belonging and solving problems and all that stuff. So I think it's incredibly important to keep them going.
Yeah.
I think a lot about the fact that like it's the voices of generations past, like their lived experiences, even if it's not directly on the page, informed their writing. Like nobody will ever be able to produce a piece exactly like any one of these stories ever again, because it was coming from this very specific experience in a very specific like time period. And I think there's so much in that, so much magic in that.
I agree.
Yeah. I really love the accessibility of a lot of these stories. Like during your Dutch story, Jeanette, like I turned to Steph and I said, and that's why we don't wear our shoes indoors. Like,
Yeah, like blue.
But as a child, you're probably like, oh, it's not just a rule that my parents are telling me. It's something that I realize has a significance to like my safety and like I understand the work that's been put in to like make the floors nice. I think it's like really like prevalent in like the zodiac. What I really loved about the zodiac growing up is like I'm sure you've seen it in Chinese restaurants. Like it tells you the personality of each of these animals. As a kid, you want to like be an animal. I'm sure you wanted to be like the white cat or like any of those that you mentioned, Mia. But like I always was like, yes, I am a horse. Like the horse is like strong and like stubborn and like all these things that is sort of mentioned in the story. But yeah, that access to like, oh, we can all cross the river, but through our individuality, like, or through our friendships, or through our alliances, or through being sneaky and clever. Steph is a snake, so like, you know,
I won.
it's really funny that they were like, oh yeah, the snake, like we're not disappointed in the snake. He was just clever about how he like strategized, you know. So I really appreciate that.
I mean, we were talking about that when we were talking about the Great Race.
Yeah.
When we were on vacation,
Yeah.
just like the interesting, like the similarity between that non-judgmental, those not judging the characters, right? Like it's the same sort of idea in, I find, like Greek or Roman like gods, where they're flawed. They're not necessarily like judged for being good or bad. They simply like have a certain like set of characteristics that then like fatal flaws that sort of like govern their characters and govern the ways that they behave in certain situations. And it's sort of in contrast to like, you know, the tradition that I was brought up in, which, you know, has like a god which is revered for being like all perfect and all knowing. It's kind of really refreshing to see like these are the characters that we sort of like look up to or we take value and guidance from. They're not perfect, they're flawed, and we see ourselves in them. We see ourselves reflected in that, in their you know, in their perfections and their imperfections, what we like, what we don't like, and we can learn something about ourselves by seeing how they react and behave and engage with the world around them. I think that's that's what I love about that zodiac story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sneaky, but it's not a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing. You scared the shit out of me, but like it's fine.
In fact, you get the feeling from the zodiac story that it doesn't matter who's first, because everybody has their special thing that makes their arrival important. So it ceases to be about who wins, right?
Yeah.
Which is great. I think that's great.
The thing, it's funny, like as you started this story, you're talking about like the rat, and I found myself looking at the circle that you had posted up. And I was going, wait a second, the dragon is number 4? Wait, how come the rat is number 1? How did the dragon not beat the rat? And I love that they like knew, like, you know, like the story knew that was exactly what you were gonna ask.
Like
they're like, here's why.
Dragon has no obstacle aside from like feeding his own ego. Like, oh, I must, like, I am almighty, I must help poor villagers and this poor rabbit, so I will sacrifice my spot.
Yeah.
Which is like telling of like those who fall under that zodiac sign are often seen as maybe have a little bit more ego than some.
Yeah, you're like, okay, you're like really noble and you do great deeds, but you're gonna be kind of arrogant about it.
Not bad, just different.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Amazing. Well, yeah. I mean, does anybody have any further sort of like things that they noticed through the stories, or things that sort of like came up for them while listening? Awesome. Yeah, it was really cool, and like this is the kind of thing that I'd love to do again, because there's no limit. There's no you know, lack of folk fairy tales, moral stories. Like certainly, like everybody's got stuff that they remember from their childhood or like from their own sort of traditions and cultures, and to continue to share those and to like hear them and hear people's perspectives on them is always quite interesting. So, you know, one day I hope that I'll be able to have an opportunity to do this kind of thing again. Yeah, But for today, thank you so much for sharing, everybody. It's been amazing.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you all.
Have a great day, everybody.
You too. Bye.
Bye.